Chapter 2. I thought about that snake as I stood on the path out of Wolf Hollow, Betty waiting ahead of me. The hair on the back of my neck rose up, and I felt a distant kinship with the wolves that had died here. Betty was wearing a gingham dress and a blue sweater that matched her eyes, and black leather shoes. Her yellow hair was pulled back in a ponytail. On the whole, but for the expression on her face, she looked harmless. I stopped when I was still 10 feet away from her. "Hey, Betty," I said. I held tight to the book cradled in my right arm. It was a history book that was so old it didn't even count Arizona as a state, but it had some good heft to it, and I thought maybe I could throw it at her if she got too close. My lunch pail wasn't heavy enough to be much good, but I gave it a little swing with my left hand so she'd see I wasn't completely unarmed. "What kind of name is Annabelle?" She had a deep voice, almost boyish. She looked at me steadily, her head down like a dog's when he's thinking about whether or not to bite. She was half smiling, her arms limp at her sides. She cocked her head to one side. I shrugged. I didn't know what kind of a name I had. "You're the rich girl," she said. "It's a rich girl name." I looked behind me to see if there was someone else on the path. Someone rich. "You think I'm rich?" It had never occurred to me that I might be considered rich, although my family was an old one that had given land for the church and the school and still had enough left for a good-sized farm. My ancestors lay beneath the finest headstones in the graveyard, and our house was, in fact, big enough for the 3 generations that now lived there, albeit cheek by jowl. We had running water. A couple of years earlier, Mr. Roosevelt had sent us the electric, and we'd had the wherewithal to wire up the house. We had a telephone mounted on our sitting room wall, which we still regarded as something of a miracle. Moreover, we did eat at Lancaster's in Swalecki maybe twice a year. But more amazing of all was the indoor privy, which my parents had recently installed now that my grandparents were old enough to deserve it. But we were not rich. "You got a purple window," Betty said. I didn't know what she was talking about until I remembered the lilac glass in our front hall window, one of the things I loved best about our house. That and the gables and the slate roof that looked like silver feathers, the big fireplace in every room, and the windows tall as doors. "My grandma told me about your purple window," Betty said. "I never heard of a purple window before, except in a church or a kingdom. Nobody has a purple window unless they're rich." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. Betty picked up a stick from along the path. It was dead wood, but I could tell from how she held it that it was still heavy. "Tomorrow, you bring me something, or I'm going to beat you with this stick." She said it so calmly that I thought she was joking, but when she took a step toward me, I went hot and felt my heart thumping. "Like what?" I said. I imagined myself lugging the purple window through the woods. "Like whatever you have." I didn't have much, just my piggy bank and the coins in it and my silver dollar and my books. A beaver muff my grandfather had once made for my grandmother, and which she had given to me when it got ratty. A lace collar that I snapped onto my church dresses, a pair of white cotton gloves that were too small for me now, and a sweater frog that I had borrowed from my Aunt Lily and she had not asked about since. I catalogued these assets quickly in my head, but I was not convinced that I would give Betty anything until she said, "I'll wait for your brothers if you don't come." They were tough little boys, my brothers, but they were smaller than I was, and they were mine to look after. I didn't see anything as Betty leaned the stick against a tree and continued up the path away from me. "And don't tell nobody about it or I'll use a rock on the little one." James. She meant James, the little one. I waited until she was out of sight, and then I got my breath back and thought about what it would feel like to be hit with a stick. A year earlier, Henry had thrown a toadstool the size of a dinner plate at me, and I'd stepped back out of the way and tripped over a dog and broken my arm. I'd burned myself a couple of times, stepped on a hoe blade and snapped the handle back into my forehead, sprained my ankle in a groundhog hole. Nothing much else had done me bodily harm in my 11 years on earth, but I'd been hurt enough to know that a whack with a branch wouldn't kill me. Still, as I passed it, I heaved the particular stick she had chosen as far as I could into the woods. There were plenty of other sticks around, but I felt a little better as I cast this one beyond her reach. I decided, as I plodded slowly up the path, that Betty wouldn't go after Henry or James until she tried me, so I'd wait to see if she was a barker or a biter before telling my parents anything that might make Betty a whole lot angrier than she already was. But I confessed to myself that I was afraid in a way I hadn't known before. I hadn't felt very much true fear in my life except about the war, that it might still be raging when my brothers grew old enough to fight the Nazis, even though farm boys were often spared. Even though by that time someone would surely have won, and I was afraid of that too. Who would win? Who would lose? We girls in the 4-H club had made a flag to hang in the church, adding a blue star every time someone from the township went off to fight. When one of them died, we changed the blue star to a gold one. Just 2 so far, but I had been to their funerals, and I knew that there was no just about it. I sometimes sat with the grown-ups and listened to the radio in the evenings after the supper dishes were done. Nobody said anything when the news came on. My mother listened with her head bowed and her hands nested and still in her mending. The talk was of concentration camps, which I thought at first meant places where people went to think hard thoughts. I do wish they were that, my father said, but they're not, Annabelle. They're prisons for people Hitler doesn't like. I had a hard time imagining why Hitler disliked so many people. Who does he like? I asked. My father thought about his answer. People with blonde hair and blue eyes, he said, which made me glad to have hair that was brown. Eyes, too. We listened to the news of bombs and submarines, smiled at the announcement that the Allies were close to retaking Italy, worried about everything else. No need to be afraid, Annabelle, my mother said, running her hand down my back. But I was. I wasn't afraid of my mother, though, despite how hard she could be sometimes. She had forgotten what it felt like to ride a swing up into the sky, to stop hoeing at the first sign of a blister, to expect anything to be easier than it was. She had been 17 when she'd had me, was only 28 the year I learned how to lie. Not much more than a girl herself, in charge of 3 generations and a good bit of farm work, too. But even when she was most impatient with me, I did not fear her. Nor was I really afraid of my Aunt Lily, though she could be alarming. A tall, thin, ugly woman who might have been handsome as a man. Aunt Lily spent her days working as a postmistress, and her nights praying and reading from her Bible and practicing dance steps in the small patch of floor at the foot of her bed. She sometimes invited me into her bedroom to listen to Peter and the Wolf on the phonograph, and now and then she put a penny into the china pig she'd given me, but her big square teeth and her feverish devotion to God frightened me. And there were times when I was afraid of my grandmother's ailing heart that forced her to go up the stairs backward, sitting down. How weak and gray she became sometimes, no longer the strong and able woman she'd once been. When we could, she and I sat on the porch swing playing I Spy, remarking on the butterflies in the front garden, hoping for a pheasant to come hopping out of the woods to poach the seeds that she scattered for the songbirds. She loved those birds, loved them, even the drab little ones, especially the drab little ones. There was nothing about my grandmother that frightened me, except the thought that she'd be gone soon. But I shared that fear with everyone in the house. Betty was mine to fear, and I decided that she was mine to disarm, if I could, on my own. But for now, I was simply happy that she was gone, and I followed so slowly that Betty was nowhere to be seen by the time I cleared the trees and made my way onto the field that was empty but for her footprints, which were deep and sharp, and suggested that she was more freighted than she could possibly be.